Hi, folks. I'm Jim. Welcome to Great Books, Big Ideas. Thought I would do another Food for Thought installment. And this comes from the book, High Minds, The Victorians and the Birth of Modern Britain by Simon Heffer. And I've been reading and learning a lot about the Corn Laws and the repeal of the Corn Laws in Victorian England. So on page 84 of this book, Heffer is discussing the work of Frederick Engels, who wrote a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844. And he was railing against the Industrial Revolution and how it was brutalizing the working classes and so forth. And then as a segue from that to the next section on page 88, I'll just cut in and quote a little bit here and there. That Engels' view of the middle classes was so prejudiced could be seen by the efforts that so many of them made to alleviate the condition of the poor. The great cause behind which they rallied was the repeal of the Corn Laws, the system of tariffs introduced by Parliament in the Depression immediately after the Napoleonic Wars to protect the landed interest in Britain by increasing the price of imported cereals. The Tory party, being the party of the landed interest, favored protection because it safeguarded their incomes. The Whig aristocracy, personified by Lord John Russell, a younger son of the Duke of Bedford, were also landowners and therefore hesitant to join any calls for its repeal, with food taking a much higher proportion of the income of low-paid people compared with the rich. The Corn Laws badly harmed the working classes. The liberal wing that was being grafted onto the Whig Party in the 1840s, especially the Manchester Liberals, personified by John Bright, and whose apostolic leader was Richard Cobden, was heavily influenced in its approach to free trade by the classical economics of Adam Smith, who 70 years earlier had argued that free markets were the fastest route to the maximization of scarce resources and therefore to prosperity. The Manchester Liberals wanted the principles they applied to the price of corn to apply to all traded commodities. A protectionist regime could only harm any industry it affected or which suffered from it in any protectionist retaliation by other trading partners. So although it was the very poorest who suffered most from the high price of food, the movement to make it cheaper was led by the middle classes, whose further prosperity depended on the widespread acceptance of the economic principle of free trade. It is no wonder that the activities of those who agitated against the Corn Laws aggrieved the landed interest. However, they also excited the suspicion of many in the working classes who feared that all the benefits of free trade would accrue to the manufacturers and not to those they employed. Landowners exploited this suspicion, arguing that some manufacturers backed repeal because if their operatives' food cost less, they could be paid less. Some working class activists in the Chartist movement believed them, which led to a mistrust between the two groups at a time when they ought to have been united against the Tories and the landowners. Okay, I'm coming back to it now. Now I'm going on pages 91 and 92. We'll talk about the debates and the effort and the sort of the propaganda that went into the repeal of the Corn Laws and what the arguments were for the repeal. So referring now to Bright again, Bright gave a new dynamism to the League's campaign, not least by attracting to it a large body of dissenters. And he was not interested in the possibilities of defeat. He embodied one of the enduring realities of the campaign. The enormous but disorganized mass of poor people could not hope to campaign successfully for repeal without the leadership of the middle class. That repeal was a largely middle-class movement, and the Chartists felt a suspicion and dislike of the middle class was a fracture in the opposition that the Tories ruthlessly exploited. In 1843, Bright took the fight into Parliament, being elected for the city of Durham in July that year. Cobden had swung the capitalists of Manchester, then the great manufacturing town of England, behind the League for reasons spelled out by Bright when he addressed a rally in Rochdale in February 1839. Quote, "The Corn Laws have had the effect of crippling the commerce and manufacturers of the country, have raised up rival manufactories in foreign countries, have been most injurious and oppressive in their operation with the great bulk of our population, and the working classes have been grievously injured by this monopoly of the landed proprietors." End quote. Feeding the poor was only part of the argument for free trade, but as the economy turned down in the early 1840s, it became the main one. The Corn Laws effectively stopped the importation of food, and it had only been the revenues from exporting food that had enabled many European countries to buy British manufactured goods. Hence, the aspirational classes, already at odds with the aristocracy after the incomplete enfranchisement of 1832, resented further the landlordism that cut the markets for their goods. For the working classes, already hard-pressed, it caused a further drop in the demand for their labor. He said that 20 millions in these realms depended on wages for their subsistence, and 1 million poor lived off public alms. He claimed the working classes were paying 40% more for their bread than if there were free trade. A working man's family, if they worked at hand looms, earned an average 10 shillings a week. The family spent an average of 5 shillings on bread, 2 shillings of which was the bread tax, 20% of the family's income. The richer a family, the lower the percentage of tax. If an income tax were introduced at such a rate, he argued, the House would never accept it. So why had it accepted this? And what I learned from this book also was this was a slow process of advocating and persuading people to repeal the Corn Laws. What pushed it over the edge was the famine in Ireland, the potato blight. So here's one last passage to talk about that and the impact it had. Peel's career, Peel was the prime minister. Peel's career was distinguished by 2 profound and equally courageous changes of mind. The most famous was on the question of the Corn Laws. Peel had opposed the Reform Act of 1832, but accepted the outcome, and in the aftermath founded a new conservative party that included moderate Whigs. In 1834, his Tamworth Manifesto, named after the town near which he held his estate and that he represented in Parliament, enshrined his relatively progressive outlook by promising institutional reform and the redress of grievances. He was well aware of the horrors concealed within industrial England. He once conceded to Ashley that colliery apprenticeships were slavery disguised. He was in such a spirit of humanity that he had finally decided that for the improved condition of the people and for the sake of trade, the Corn Laws had to go. He had already grasped this when news came from Ireland of the poor potato crop in 1845, with the previous year's yield of nearly 15,000 tons dropping to 10,000 because of an unusual form of blight. This disaster, given the heavy dependence of people and livestock on the crop, would become a catastrophe in 1846 when the yield collapsed to 3,000 tons. It provided the perfect opportunity for free traders who argued that in order to feed the Irish, the price of bread had to be made to fall. There was also a poor harvest in England in 1845. Lord Heytesbury, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, wrote to Peel in November 1845 to describe in detail the extent of the problem and the failure thus far of men of science to do much about it. Quote, "Neither the extent of the calamity nor the period of the year when the pressure may become urgent can be foreseen with certainty," he wrote. The new failed crop was all there was to feed most of the Irish for the next year. If this provision be exhausted or destroyed prematurely, Heytesbury continued, scarcity and even famine are inevitable. In Peel's mind, and increasingly over the next few weeks in the minds of more of his colleagues, that could mean only one thing: removing the duties on imported corn so that there would be enough bread to feed the Irish. Charles Greville wrote in his diary on 16 November 1845 that the evil of the potato failure meant that every man is watching with intense anxiety the progress of events and inquiring whether the corn laws will break down under this pressure or not. Greville also noted that the crisis had caused such a loss of confidence in the economy that it had halted railway speculation. Peel received a message from the Queen to say that the Queen thinks the time has come when a removal of the restrictions upon the importation of food cannot be successfully resisted. Should this be Sir Robert's own opinion, the Queen very much hopes that none of his colleagues will prevent him from doing what it is right to do. And so, not long thereafter, the Corn Laws were repealed. Simon Heffer, High Minds, talking about tariffs, talking about the Corn Laws, talking about class divides. Food for thought.